Introduce my friend and colleague, Dan Byman, a senior fellow at the Saban Center for the Middle East Policy at Brookings, director of Georgetown University Center for Peace and Security Studies. Interestingly, around the time that Dan took over, Foreign Policy's annual poll of what's the best place to study international relations, Georgetown University came top, much as I think a lot to do with Dan's running of that program. Previously a staff member on the 9/11 Commission, previously also director for Middle East Policy at the RAND organization. Before that, a political analyst with the U.S. government, which is a coded word of saying the agency, a PhD from MIT, and the author of several books, including The Five-Front War and also Deadly Connection, States That Sponsor Terrorism. So Dan is going to speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll throw it open to questions.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you very much for having me here at New America. I just wrote a book that my publisher insists has absolutely no constituency whatsoever, and I pride myself in very bad timing. My book neither says that the Bush administration is a bunch of incompetent idiots that deserve to be court-martialed, nor does it say that the enemy is 20 feet tall. If only those pansies in Congress would get their act together, we could save our nation. I'm trying to write a book that looks at current policy towards counterterrorism, looks at strengths and weaknesses, and makes recommendations. But it's very much a glass, I would say, 2/5 full sort of book, where some things are actually going rather well, lots are going quite poorly. But for much of what's going quite poorly, I'm actually not sure how much better can be done. I certainly think there are a number of mistakes being made in U.S. policy. But in many cases, the proposals people have of fixing them, I think, are almost as flawed as the policies themselves. My attempt was to kind of look at different U.S. counterterrorism instruments, which I'm calling fronts in the book, and it's the Five-Front War. It was initially the Six-Front War, but my publisher persuaded me that alliteration should triumph over scholarship, so I dropped a front. It's a sign of the times that from the title, at least, I dropped the diplomatic front. It's still in the book, but this is the purpose of the book. Before I do so, though, I want to go into U.S. counterterrorism. I want to spend a few minutes talking about al-Qaeda as an adversary, and I have to say, standing here next to Peter Bergen, Peter is one of the people whose writings and spoken words have informed my thinking on this quite a bit. Very briefly, why is this such a dangerous organization? Let's talk about the organization after 9/11. What's interesting is that the organization has a very flexible hierarchy and organizational system. It's been able to do top-down operations to some degree, also delegate a fair amount of control at the operational level. It's the rare organization that can shift from a high degree of hierarchy to a certain level of networking and back and forth. The one caveat I want to make with this is that this is not a fully networked organization, and I think that's the goal of the organization is actually to be more hierarchical. In the scholarly world, at least, there's this kind of buzz about networks and how wonderful they are and how they always beat hierarchies. I always kind of joke, could you imagine a network invading Normandy? Which is, oh, you brought some close air support. That's wonderful. I happen to have brought some ships. You need hierarchy for most actions, and there's a reason that states and organizations have a fair amount of hierarchy in them. And whenever al-Qaeda has had a chance, it's usually increased the level of centralization and hierarchy within it. Right now, I would say that there is some centralization for strategic control, for propaganda, but less so on an operational level. Second strength of the group is that for the core in particular, the relatively small group around bin Laden, it's a group of leaders. Part of the founding documents, part of what they talk about is they want people who can play nice in the sandbox. And that's actually a very rare commodity among violent groups in general. Usually an underground organization, highly ideological organization, tends to attract lots of very strong personalities that can't cooperate. For those of you who have ever been part of a modern university, you may know some parallels. But it is this problem of these strong personalities, but what al-Qaeda has been able to do is replace the people it's lost because it grows leaders. It's worth doing a Google search on al-Qaeda's number 3. And the good news is we got him. His name was Mohammed Atif. His name was Abu Zubaydah. His name was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and we can go on. But they've been able to lose very senior people and keep the organization running, not without difficulty, but even so. And the comparison I make, and I try to provoke with this, is with a good modern military organization, where if Iraqi insurgents right now could wave a magic wand and kill every colonel in the U.S. military, it would be a real blow. But you have lieutenant colonels and majors trained to take their place. And al-Qaeda has trained its more junior people to take initiative, to rise as appropriate, and as a result, it's able to replace its leaders. It's worth pointing out the obvious as well. Much of its agenda is widely popular. Not all of its agenda, but al-Qaeda has embraced a lot of causes, or tried to embrace, ranging from the Palestinians to Chechnya to Kashmir, and of course Iraq and Afghanistan. And it's hard for us in our counter-propaganda to divorce the organization from these causes. And this has also enabled, this kind of broad umbrella, has enabled the organization to weave itself into many local insurgencies. And the places I just mentioned, we can name a few others, where you have insurgent organizations that have their own agendas, their own focus, but share part of what al-Qaeda stands for. And you can even go beyond this and talk about the organization as an ideology, a set of values embracing jihad, anti-Americanism, against regimes in the Arab world and to a lesser degree the Muslim world, and we can go on. But the result is it's actually quite unclear how big this organization is. I think I could stand before you and credibly claim that there are a couple hundred people in this organization. I think I can also credibly claim that there are about 12 million people that we're dealing with regard to the ideology and so on. And when you think about counterterrorism, you have to think about which particular pocket you're concerned about. As it's worth pointing out that the 200 matter much more in some ways than the 12 million. And not all the 12 million want to kill Americans. In fact, the vast majority are rather indifferent to that and have other goals. But you can't completely divorce the 12 million from the 200. What's changed for the organization? One of the biggest is that the organization is on the rebound after being devastated in Afghanistan in 2001, 2002. Being kicked out of Afghanistan, having the Taliban fall, was a huge operational blow. They lost their haven. They lost a place where they could train and organize. And at the same time, you had a worldwide manhunt, where you have senior al-Qaeda figures complaining in private correspondence saying the whole world is really an extension of the CIA. And as a result, they're losing people, they're losing operators all around the world. But I think perhaps even more important, they lost credibility even within radical circles. That you have people who are sympathetic to much of their worldview saying, why did you wake the sleeping giant of the United States? We had an Islamic government called the Taliban's Afghanistan. And we needed 50 years to have that government mature and become strong. And you wasted it. You prided the United States, and the United States almost, in an act of absent-mindedness, just kind of swatted this government away. It was much easier than many people in this country thought, to say nothing of many people around the world. And as a result, the organization was discredited in radical circles. The Iraq invasion restored it. It vindicated its narrative, and that's a word academics like to use, but it vindicated the way al-Qaeda sees the world, which is it's not just that there are all these local problems, but that the United States is behind them all. And having a couple 100,000 American troops show up in the heart of the Islamic world helped. And in particular, this organization had been feuding with other people in the Salafi movement. And we tend to lump jihadists and Salafis together, people who embrace a very puritanical view of Islam. But in reality, there are huge divisions within this community. And the Salafis were very critical of al-Qaeda, in particular because of its use of jihad, where they would say, look, you guys say that if a Christian beats up a Muslim somewhere in the Philippines, that's jihad. And that's crazy. Jihad can only be declared by legitimate scholars, and it has to be something really big, such as a couple 100,000 Christians showing up in the middle of the Muslim world. So this unified a community that previously had been very critical of al-Qaeda. The second big change has really happened in the last couple of years, which is the organization has reestablished itself in Pakistan. And here I'd like to commend Peter's recent article in the New Republic that talks about the organization's restoration. This is a tremendous success for the organization. We've seen a lot of the post-9/11 attacks in Europe and elsewhere emanating from Pakistan. And there's a huge Pakistani diaspora. And as a result, the personal connections between al-Qaeda operators and their local Pakistani counterparts and people in Western Europe in particular are often quite strong. I tend to divide the two, where Iraq has really helped with inspiration, convincing much of the jihadist movement that, and much of the community, that they really should fight, they should stand up to the United States, while Pakistan has really helped with operations. The key operators have a fair degree of freedom. If you look at their propaganda, they're putting out propaganda faster than Peter and I can sit there and analyze it. My recent anecdote on this is that bin Laden's statements no longer are really seen as big news by noon. I was doing a radio interview on the latest bin Laden statement, and they called me about 15 minutes before and said, "We're going to bump you back 15 minutes. Do you mind?" I said, "No, yeah, whatever, I'm your captive." And the story before me was about a chicken that had eaten a charm bracelet of a young boy. And it was a very interesting story, so I understand the logic, but I think it shows how these statements of senior al-Qaeda leaders are not electrifying. The world is not waiting in the same way, in part for some historical reasons. They haven't produced the same results they used to produce, but also in part because they're churning out so much that one particular addition to the overall group doesn't mean as much. It's worth pointing out divisions within the adversary as well. And here I think there's a tendency to paint this organization as 10 feet tall. When, I wouldn't make it 1 feet tall, but I'm probably at about 3.5 feet. It's definitely smaller than people in this room. The first I mentioned is this division between Salafis and jihadists, which is a very, very wide division. A second division is along nationalism lines, that just like any international movement, whether it's communism, any sort of ideological movement that tries to unite people across national lines, there are going to be differences. And this has always been a problem for al-Qaeda, where there's been resentment of the prominence of Egyptians there. And in particular, this bleeds into a third problem, which is disagreement on the nature of the enemy and priorities. I think if you gave most jihadists a list, and you put Russia on the list, and the United States on the list, and Australia on the list, and Pakistan on the list, and Arab regimes on the list, on and on, put the Shia on the list, put the Jews on the list, they'd all agree we hate them. But where do you begin? And that's a very difficult question. And if you look at some of their training materials and so on, what you see is actually incoherence. I think bin Laden would say the focus should be on the United States, but that's by no means shared even within the al-Qaeda core. And especially as you go from those 200 to 12 million, you get tremendous divergence. And from a very selfish U.S. point of view, that matters tremendously. We care understandably more about American lives. In a secondary way, we care about the lives of U.S. allies. But as you get farther from that core, you have the concerns of other peoples about whom we wish well, but not whom we're willing to sacrifice our own lives and treasure. So that difference in priorities matters quite a bit. An important difference as well is their attitude towards political Islam. There's a tendency as well to not only lump Salafists in with the jihadists, but also the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood certainly doesn't like the United States. And it's perfectly reasonable to treat it as an adversary in certain ways. But the bitterness between the jihadists and groups like the Muslim Brotherhood is intense. If you look at the vitriol that someone like Zawahiri heaps upon the United States, it's nothing compared to what he heaps upon the Muslim Brotherhood. Their participation in politics, and in general the sense that they're willing to compromise and not always fight, enrages the jihadists. And in part because the Brotherhood is much better at recruiting and much better at getting a mainstream presence. So not surprisingly, there's resentment. This is the key competition. The last thing I'll add is a related point, which is the question of who is an apostate, the question of takfir. And this is something that has the potential to tear the movement apart. Bin Laden himself has always preached a very big tent approach towards Islam. Even the Shia, he'll say basically, we have differences with our Shia brothers, but we can resolve them after resolving many other bigger problems. But much of his organization is divided on this question. There's a debate right now in Iraqi jihadist circles over should you target the three sons? Should you target the Crusaders, meaning the Americans? Should you target the Zionists? Or should you target the Shia? And that last bit is a huge part of the Muslim world and has attracted, because of Iraq, the attention of much of the jihadist movement. But you can go beyond that. Some parts of this movement have declared Muslims who don't fully cooperate with the jihadists to be apostate. And this happened in Algeria, where in the 1990s the movement really turned on itself and just became a killing machine of Algerian society. And once that happened, it was relatively easy, for the Algerian regime to turn the people against it, because there was a sense that they'll just kill anyone unless they're fully in accord with these guys. Okay. So what are the dimensions of the response? These are relatively obvious. Intelligence, military, diplomacy. Add to that homeland security. The war of ideas, political reform. The obvious point is you need all of these, some for the short term, some for the long term. My book goes into all of these, but I'm really only going to focus on the military, homeland security, and ideas just to give you a flavor. My caveat is, I mentioned political reform. I'm actually somewhat skeptical of political reform as a counterterrorism tool, if people would like to discuss that in questions and answers. Most of the debate about the military tends to focus on should the military be the counterterrorism instrument or not. This is a rather foolish way of thinking about the use of military force. There are some very important uses of the military. One of the biggest is simply to make sure that there's no new regime like the Taliban that openly supports the jihadist movement, that gives it a haven. We need the ability to topple regimes like that. And that calls for quite large military forces that can do extremely difficult operations. But beyond that, on a more day-to-day basis, you get into two issues. One is that you are aiding allied militaries in fighting insurgencies. And this actually doesn't require huge numbers of troops, but it requires them to be used primarily in a support mission. At times this might be providing limited intelligence or logistics, but often it's just training. And also targeted killing. That occasionally you'll need the military to go after an al-Qaeda member who cannot be arrested, who is simply too far away from the forces of law or the forces of allies. And the alternative is either killing him or letting him go free. To be clear, targeted killing doesn't work as a deterrent. It's not going to stop these guys from hating us. But it can affect capabilities. That if you do it enough, it can take out enough key operators. It's very tough with a group like al-Qaeda, though, because they have a very deep bench. They have lots and lots of people. That said, it still has some impact. But I think even more important are misuses of the military. One I think we've seen is when the United States becomes directly involved in counterinsurgency. It's a very nasty business, but in general, when outsiders try to engage in this, you pick up all sorts of new adversaries. All of a sudden, the 18-year-old on the street who doesn't really care too much one way or another about this sees a bunch of people who don't look like him, who don't talk like him, lording it over his community, and becomes enraged. And when that can be avoided, it should at all costs. The other is the use of limited retaliatory strikes. 1986 in Libya, 1993 in Iraq, 1998 in Afghanistan and Sudan. For the most part, these didn't fail. These backfired. These made the situation actively worse. Terrorism increased. It strengthened the kind of the sex appeal, for lack of a better term, of the terrorists we're going after. And it's exceptionally difficult for that amount of force to work. In a way, it's exactly the wrong amount of force. It's dramatic enough where these groups can look like they're standing up to the United States, but not dramatic enough to actually do any serious damage. What you need to do then from the military is actually quite difficult. Some are quite simple. I think you can change the focus of special operations forces away from door kicking and direct action towards training as they were originally intended for. But important is to dodge the temptation to do something. That if there is an attack, you need to respond militarily for public relations reasons. A colleague of mine used to call that tomahawk therapy. That you feel better after launching a few tomahawks. That's something that, again, not only doesn't work, but actually makes the situation worse. The thing I'll put out there is the United States should be planning for, at least, military operations in Pakistan on a much wider scale. I don't think we should be doing it now. But you have the possibility of the situation in Pakistan unraveling dramatically. And the haven going from a sizable but still limited haven to an even more dramatic one. Let's switch to Homeland Security. On Homeland Security, almost all the debate focuses on two things. The utter bureaucratic incompetence, mismanagement within DHS, or the poor spending in terms of how it goes around the country. Sure, I'll grant that. To me, though, those are second-order questions. The first-order question is simply, what do we want to defend? We use a very sophisticated planning tool right now, as far as I can tell, which is the wouldn't it suck if planning tool, where we say, wouldn't it be lousy if terrorists attacked a port and messed up throughput or so on? The problem is that when you take this approach, you end up shoveling huge amounts of money, really tremendous, not just from the federal government, but in private sector costs and in terms of inefficiencies. You're talking tens, hundreds of billions of dollars. And it's quite unclear if it's working. There's no real way of measuring it. And in fact, what you tend to do is you have a risk of alienating people who might otherwise be supportive. So elites from the Middle East who want to come here to shop or send their kids to school don't come here because they're concerned about harassment and more cumbersome procedures. But the result is we lose goodwill in the Middle East. Right now, the United States has an overwhelming advantage over almost every other country in the Western world, which is the Muslim American population is well integrated, well educated, affluent, everything that we want from American citizens. And in fact, many of the tips from the rather limited terrorist plots in the United States have come from the community. Anything that risks alienating that community would be a strategic disaster, even if the tactical benefits are real. And we always need to keep that in mind, because when we're designing programs, we always tend to think about the tactics. When we're doing these programs, we also need to think about the inner logic of the terrorist group. What would resonate overseas? What would resonate to 18-year-old constituents that they want to appeal to? And here, I have yet to see a very credible terrorist plot against a major U.S. port. I have yet to see economic targeting go well beyond the symbolic. There are symbolic targets like the stock exchange, but those are dramatic. Are they going to do something that's going to decrease U.S. wheat production by 2%, which would be a huge blow? But we talk about that, but there's no indication that they're planning that in a serious way. We also need to prioritize, and that's easy to say. But whenever someone says we should prioritize, the key question is, what do we not defend? And my answer is, don't defend quite a bit. That there's such a huge range of things people can attack that it's almost impossible to defend against it. A trivia question I often ask is, what is the second most deadly terrorist attack in modern history? And most people think of airplanes and so on. The answer is arson at a movie theater in Iran. And it's people locked a door, poured gasoline, burned the theater down. Not very complex. Not a mastermind operation. And the point is that if people want to kill others, it's not too hard. And that when you pour lots of money into defenses, it's going to be very hard to stop lethal attacks one way or another. So you do want to defend a few things, but quite limited. Even more important is building up a degree of domestic resilience. And that's making people, if we lose 5 people in an anthrax attack, that it doesn't shut down our country. And giving people some sense of the odds. My expectations of government, regardless of political party, are relatively low. But I do think that politicians could try to make the situation better when it comes to fear-mongering rather than worse. But this is something that, to be clear, both sides of the political aisle, I think, have done a poor job of, which is really kind of trumpeting the dangers. And the result is whenever there's an attack, people tend to overreact. And the economic consequences are extremely dangerous. People have asked me, what should we do if there's a radiological attack in Washington? Radiological material spews around. My view is get inside and stay off the roads. Because if you go on the roads, you can be killed. It's going to be very dangerous getting out of town. People are going to be crazy. And I think you'd have far more deaths from traffic and panic than you'd likely have from the actual attack. And that's something our government can fix. That's something that a communication strategy can do. The model I use, and only slightly in jest, shortly after 9/11, there was an explosion at a French chemical refinery. And those of us who watch terrorism were very concerned about this, so we're all paying attention. And then about 3 hours later, a spokesman for the French government gets on and says, it's not terrorism, it was an accident, we checked it out. A couple of years later, a colleague of mine interviewed the person who made that statement and said, how did you do it? In the US system, it would take 3 weeks to issue that kind of degree of confidence. The guy's like, oh, we made it up. It was just, we didn't know, so we didn't want people to panic. For the record, I'm not in favor of lying to the American people by members of government. But that said, I do think that rather than assume the worst, people can try to present a more coherent strategy that really emphasizes risk. Lastly, just because I want to get to your questions, thoughts on what people have called the war of ideas. I'm intensely skeptical of calls to use public diplomacy as a magic wand. I love the idea that some, GS-14 in the State Department can design a radio spot that can make everyone love the United States. And if that guy can do it, God bless him, But realistically, if the debate in the Middle East is about U.S. policies towards Israel and U.S. policies towards Iraq, we're not going to be that popular. And I'm okay with that. I don't really think our goal should be popular over having good policies. But we have to recognize that. And instead, we're engaging much of this community on those issues. So the result is, I mean, it's kind of, like a politician, on the old line of, no, I don't beat my wife. You can make that argument quite credibly, but simply having those sorts of debates are going to work against you. I think the real key is to flip it and go back to a very strong American tradition. And it's election season, so we'll see this too, which is the attack ad. We have a gift in this country for tearing other people down. And the good news is, with al-Qaeda, there's tremendous material to work with. That this is an organization that's exceptionally unpopular in most of its policies. It's done tremendous brutality, including to women and children. My personal view is that if we can make the debate about the killing of Muslims in Muslim countries, if we can make the debate about the blinding of Africans in 1998 and the embassy attacks, we'll win those debates. And no matter how good their propaganda is, simply having that debate will discredit them. Unfortunately, almost all our programs are designed to kind of pump up the image of the United States, which doesn't hurt. I don't want to say this is a complete waste, but I think we'll get relatively little leverage on that. I will spare you my thoughts on diplomacy, political reform, and intelligence, though I'm more than happy to answer questions on that. And I would welcome your thoughts and comments. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dan. We'll open it to Q&A, and if you could identify yourselves before you ask a question. Two quick questions, Dan. One is, how did you arrive at the 12 million figure of people who might be, is that an al-Qaeda sympathizer? Is that well, what exactly is that 12 million, and how did you come to it? The other question is, al-Qaeda's, one of al-Qaeda's main strategic weaknesses is killing a lot of Muslim civilians. There's no doubt about that. But how is the United States credibly going to be able to push that message when we're killing, as it turns out, more Afghan civilians than the Taliban is, at least Afghan, NATO, and U.S. military forces are?
The 12 million figure, to be clear, is largely made up, but I made it up based on, I feel, intelligent estimates of others. There was a very good international crisis group report on Indonesia and another very good report on Saudi Arabia that talked about the percentage of people actively sympathetic to a jihadist ideology being about 1%. And it said between 1% and 2%. And from there I extrapolated to the 1.2 billion Muslims, recognizing that in some countries there is more susceptibility and some less, and trying to kind of base it vaguely on those figures. So the 12 million comes from about 1% of Muslims. So this is something that people often say, and as Peter knows, there's a danger in underestimating numbers and also overestimating. A good example is when people say only 1% of Iraqis are actively supportive of this movement. That sounds quite small, to have 99% to 1. But if you go off a figure of 30 million, you're talking 300,000 people. That's a huge number of people. And since many insurgent groups and many terrorist groups in the world have been effective in shutting down countries with a couple hundred people, that if you're really talking 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, those are still quite scary numbers for active cadre. So the 12 million was a sympathizer number. And that's presumably something that would go between, in my opinion, 1 million and 25 million on any given day, whether the jihadists are looking good or bad, or whether the United States is looking good or bad. The other question of how do you convince people that the organization is worse than America, given that American troops and NATO troops are certainly have had significant casualties they've inflicted. Hard. And in part hard because the soldier in full gear attracts the camera like a magnet. That's a very, very tough image to get away from. My hope, realistically, given that counterinsurgency is a rather nasty business, and there's no way around that, you can reduce the nastiness, but you can't eliminate it, is that when you are looking at these organizations, when an individual is, that someone who might be sympathetic says a pox on both your houses. That I'm not going to support the United States, but I'm also not going to support these guys. And that's vital because a lot of what this organization depends on is not popular goodwill for recruitment or fundraising, but in a broader sense for trying to avoid intelligence, and trying to ensure the cohesion of its movement. They want to be heroes. They want to be lauded in neighborhoods. They want people to warn them when the police are on their tail. And if you can make them into simply a third group, then many of the other intelligence gathering functions come in. You can bribe people, and they'll turn them in. You can make the organization more on the run because it can't trust people to hide them. And as a result, disrupt operations because they're spending half their time hiding.
Okay. Don Wallace, I'm a law professor at Georgetown. Actually, I had 3 questions, but the first was, who are the 12 million and how strongly are they attached? But I think you will answer that. The other 2 are, you talked about Homeland Security and inability to prioritize. How would you prioritize? Something actually I raised with Ambassador Admiral Stevenson Abbott at the beginning and didn't get too much of a response. And the final question is, how important is Osama bin Laden if he were to die or disappear?
How would I prioritize? There are a few targets that we know are on the radar screen, and that's a few key political leaders, so protecting the President of the United States and a few other very senior leaders. There are other targets up. Amazingly enough, they go after civil aviation, constantly. And if you did this from a gaming point of view, if you were a political scientist and you kind of stepped back and said, how should they attack? The last target they should ever attack is civil aviation. It's the most defended target around. And yet they constantly go after it. The last the 2 plots that have come closest, I think, Richard Reed and then the 2006 plot, were both civil aviation plots. And when you compare that to the ease of a metro attack or arson, it is amazing. And so the symbolic value of that is tremendous. So civil aviation, a few political symbolic targets. And then there are a few targets that, although they haven't shown that much inclination in attacking, are so potentially catastrophic you guard them. But you would guard them against crime and vandalism and a wacko in any event. So what don't you guard, to me, is the bigger question. And I would not be guarding metros. I would not be doing guarding on ports beyond what we're doing for crime at the moment, crime and smuggling. I think that these are relatively low, they're extremely high cost, low payoff options. I would instead be putting more money into domestic intelligence. To me, I think you have a much better chance of actually finding what you need through these networks. And I think the danger, of course, is, as I mentioned, alienating the U.S. Muslim population. But I think you can work with it quite effectively at the moment. The importance of bin Laden. I actually see him as tremendously important for a couple of reasons. One is that he still does provide some strategic guidance to the movement. Take that out, I think the movement would still be fine in a broader sense. But he also is a symbol. He's someone who, the comparison I like to make is, I don't follow boxing anymore, but if I stepped into the ring with Mike Tyson even today, go back a few years, we all know what would happen, right? I'd be in the hospital. It's not a really difficult call. If I got a couple blows in, you all would be pretty impressed, right? If I got 3 punches in before he put me in the hospital, I would be shocked. Let's say I last 5 rounds. I mean, I think the headline the next day is going to be Byman beats Tyson, and the subheading would be Byman in hospital. But even so, it'd be amazing. And bin Laden, I think quite clearly, read Peter's book, did not expect to be alive at this moment. And he successfully defied the United States in a major manhunt. Presidential statements, huge degree of resources, even if cut by the Iraq War. And that's a form of victory. That's a form of defiance, especially for a community where outright victory has been relatively rare. So losing or defiance with grace is a huge success. And I'll add to that, I think his deputy, who is the likely successor, would not be a very good leader. Operationally, he's probably more skilled than bin Laden. So we might see some clever attacks or some things we don't anticipate. From the point of view of running an underground organization, probably more skilled than bin Laden. You'll see a lot of very skillful counterintelligence and so on. But he's a divider. He's someone who historically has turned against other people you would think would be in the same community.
Is he Egyptian?
Yes, yeah, exactly, he's a Wahhabi. And he's preached takfir against the Muslim Brotherhood. He's pushed it against other parts of society. Now, having said all this, in Iraq, the letters we have from him, he's been, unfortunately, reasonably responsible. He's encouraged the Iraqi jihadists not to kill Shia right and left, and not to do beheadings, and otherwise try to recognize the popular image. But that said, I think he's a much more rigid personality and as a result would be a much worse leader.
Hi, Phil Smucker, author of Al-Qaeda's Great Escape. I'm an independent journalist. I want to ask you about the credibility gap that you talk about. And we could first look at the American side, because I think you have to ask who had the most credibility to lose around the world. And you mentioned Indonesia, because I was recently in Indonesia, and I did a lot of work with young people on campuses, kind of Q&A, questioning them. And it seems that in many cases, America's lost so much credibility by default. Osama bin Laden becomes the man. You know, he's the guy in the room now, 10,000-pound gorilla, because we have lost so much credibility. So I'm wondering, you know, one would also say, you know, for Al-Qaeda, all publicity is good publicity. You know, to the degree, how much credibility did they really have to lose when they started this game? And so if you could just analyze that a little bit.
When they started, they had not much to lose. That's the joy of being a radical organization, is you can try and fail. And that's something that most people miss when they look at terrorist groups, is the vast majority fail, you know, in a miserable, humiliating way. And if you look at, I think, the organization's strategy in its first 5 years in particular, it failed all the time. And it went to a strategy, to me, that is almost inherently doomed to failure in a broader sense, because it's trying to target regimes like the United States that we're not going to change our political system. And I don't think they're going to have a huge impact on us, but it is much easier from an operational and tactical point of view than going after something like the government of Egypt, where it's a bit more brittle, certainly, than the U.S. system. But when you go after the government of Egypt, you tend to lose 200 operators each time you do it. I mean, it's a very dangerous activity. That said, once the organization succeeded, I think credibility mattered a lot to it. And I think that's why it was so concerned about Iraq. Both, it wanted to be riding this wave, but at the same time wanted to make sure Iraq conformed to certain standards. We saw this in a different way in Algeria in around 1996, 1997, where the organization was very concerned about the reputation of the broader jihadist movement. So I think credibility does matter to it. And where the organization has been hurt at times, it's when governments have been able to undermine its credibility by suggesting that these are people who are largely thugs, who have no understanding of Islam, who go after the innocent, and so on. This is something where the imbalance was profound at first, but I really think that it's more even, so there is a lot more for them to lose as well.
And the Americans, I mean, the idea that that young people just basically don't believe America anymore because of, well, you know, we stood for some things in the world that we no longer stand for, obviously, not least of which is the moral high ground. And can you just address that briefly?
Sure. I mean, I tend to divide, you know, ideas and public opinion into multiple audiences. And the 18 to 25-year-old young male audience in the Muslim world, which is the key jihadist audience, it ain't going to trust the United States on anything. And, you know, the comparison I make is, you know, have to be careful in Washington, but, you know, how many people in this room are, you know, Kucinich followers? And, you know, I'm guessing a relatively small number of people. And how many of you know someone who is? Relatively small someone. Okay, there you go. And that's, the number of Kucinich followers is roughly comparable to the number of people who have a favorable opinion of the United States in a country like Jordan. So you have to be as out of the mainstream as that person, you know, to really have a favorable opinion of the United States, which is stunning when you think about it. So that audience I don't have much hope for. My hope is simply that rather than making them at all pro-American, they become not pro-Bin Laden. But as you move away from it, I think you have more and more hope. And in part that can be, again, on turning them against the jihadists. In part it can be, you know, leveraging things like earthquake aid and so on. But there's going to be a limit. You know, U.S. policies, a number of them are unpopular. And I'm not terribly against all that. You know, I'm okay with some U.S. policies being unpopular. To me, you know, it's a big world out there. And I think we should support the government of Saudi Arabia. And I think it's a thuggish government that I'm not terribly attracted to. But I think the alternatives are worse, and it's an ally of the United States, and so be it. But we have to recognize that comes with a cost. And there is a legitimate question to me, though, which is, how much does public opinion matter on a day-to-day level for counterterrorism? Because a lot of the studies of recruitment have shown that it's not an individual who's watching television just says, I can't take it anymore. It's these kind of personal networks of people who will, their cousin was recruited, and then their cousin comes back and recruits them. The overall opinion of the United States in that world does matter to some degree as to which target they go after, but not inherently to the recruitment process. And I think that there's been this rather facile assumption that an unpopular United States means lots of recruitment for jihadists. And there may be, I think there is a link there, but I think it's much more complex than our analysis has revealed so far.
Dan, Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. And it occurs to me that after listening to you describe how significant you think bin Laden is, that if he got bumped for the chicken and the charm bracelet, maybe that's really what we ought to be talking about here today. What I'm interested in is, I'm thinking about this sort of public diplomacy question that Peter touched on in one of his questions about whether we can develop messages successfully that speak to some audiences in that part of the world. I want to talk about this country. And I don't know whether this really goes to what you deal with in your book, so I may be off topic. Let me just try it. Driving here this morning from Annapolis, I was listening to the Diane Rehm show, and it was an hour of people talking about waterboarding and whether it's legal or whether it's illegal, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a reminder of how 9/11 and its aftermath has changed the way, to put it in pretty simple terms, the things we think about and talk about. And what I'm trying to get at, I'm not quite sure how to phrase the question, is whether through a succession of sort of homeland security tactics and messages, code orange, code green, code whatever it is, reminders along throughways to be alert for suspicious activity. I guess I want to say that I am at least as interested in what we can do over the next X number of years to sort of get America off its terror mentality. And my question is, A, is that a naive perspective? And B, have you thought about, written about that kind of approach to the subject matter generally that you're dealing with?
I have, and I'm actually very interested in this question. I'm interested in this question for a couple of reasons. One, I think that many of the tools that we started to use after 9/11 are now being questioned. Waterboarding being very prominent, but domestic wiretapping, renditions, secret detentions. There's a pretty long list of, I don't want to say new things because there are parallels in the past, but either somewhat new policies or old ones we put on steroids. And there hasn't been a real public debate on this. And the result is, I think we'll tend to oscillate, where I'm someone who's for renditions, but I think we should change the program fairly significantly to reduce the chance of abuses. Doesn't eliminate it, but reduce it. But without
actually a clarification there, because I mean, a rendition classically would be taking somebody from Pakistan, let's say, and bringing them to the United States for trial.
Right.
Extraordinary rendition would be taking somebody from Uzbekistan and taking them to Egypt and having they would likely be tortured. So, are you in favor of both renditions and extraordinary renditions, or merely renditions?
I'm in favor of both renditions and extraordinary renditions. And I'll make a detour on renditions for a moment and then come back to your question because it's an interesting one. My view on renditions is that at times there is no answer to the question of what do you do with the suspect you find in Pakistan, where you have some evidence, but it's not quite good enough for a U.S. court of law. The Pakistanis certainly don't want to try him or extradite him. What do you do with that person? And the problem with the U.S. system is we don't have this category right now. And the Bush administration has tried, and rather disastrously, I think. But an example I use is people tend to talk about the classification issue. What if all our evidence is highly secret. Let's skip that one. What if our evidence is primarily hearsay, which from an intelligence point of view is pretty good? You know, you get the right hearsay, you know, that's not bad. What do you do with that sort of evidence? And here the question, here to me, sending them to a country where hearsay is more acceptable. I'm okay with if it's a very senior person, if you're very confident of the evidence, and if there's a system within the system where the decision is not made by an operator, where there's someone, in the old days I would have said, what you really want is someone like a U.S. attorney who can objectively look at the information, who can kind of vet it. That was before I used to get laughed at by saying no one would ever politicize the U.S. attorney positions. But that's that sort of person within government, or if you need to outside the government, something mild on the FISA court, where it's a different legal standard. But there's still a standard. There's still someone addressing the evidence. And as a result, there's still some due process. I want the GS-15 who's going after the target to be gung-ho about it. I don't want them to have to be the person who steps back and says, maybe all my evidence is wrong. I think that will never work. But that said, that person should not be making the final call on the rendition. Also, you need to render someone to where they're actually going to face trial. Now, that doesn't mean a completely fair trial. You know, this is, let's say, Egypt. You know, I don't want to be naive about this. But you don't want renditions to become disappearances. You don't want people to simply vanish into a black hole where there is no legal process. And you have to recognize that there is a risk of abuse and torture. You can press against it, but you know, you can say don't do that. But when someone disappears into the Egyptian prison system, that is going to happen from time to time.
But in practice, every extraordinary rendition that we're aware of, you know, if people go to Syria or Jordan or Yemen or Egypt or Morocco, everybody emerges with tales fairly credible of torture. I mean, so the assurances that they're not going to be tortured apparently are not really worth anything.
And it's an interesting question how hard we've been trying. I don't know how hard the assurances. In some countries, I mean, you know, Syria to me should always be, you know, off the table. And then you get to the question of relative degrees of brutality. And it's a nasty question. But the alternative to me is what do you do about the individuals who are sitting there who you can't arrest, you can't render back home? You know, ironically, when I have this discussion with my class, the question, we have the same discussion on target killings. And the answer is, oh yeah, you could take a shot. You could try to kill the person for that. Render them, that'd be disastrous. You know, they might be tortured. And the implication is that it's more acceptable to kill someone.
Actually, Dan, can I sort of
Yeah,
follow
no, please, it's very
up? Related kind of question, because I mean, some people have suggested that a way to sort of solve a lot of these problems, whether it's Guantanamo or the extraordinary renditions or whatever, is to set up a new legal system in the United States, would be a national security courts, where you'd have federal judges who could handle classified evidence and all this sort of stuff. I mean, is that would that be kind of like just another level of bureaucracy on all this and kind of come freighted with all sorts of other legal problems, or is that actually kind of a good idea? So you migrate people out of the military commissions into this national security court.
I think, I mean, I have to be careful because I'm not a lawyer, and I'll go back to why that matters so much on this. Notionally, I'm in favor of some sort of legal system for handling those cases. I am very morally uncomfortable with the idea of sending someone to Egypt for justice, regardless of the individual involved. The problem, and here's where I have to be careful, immediately after 9/11, I was very sympathetic to the Bush administration's contention that the enemy combatants didn't fit neatly into any of the categories we have. You know, these aren't prisoners of war, they're not common criminals, our laws don't quite work for them. What I didn't realize, which I think any lawyer worth his or her salt would realize instantly, is that when you say you want something new, you have to invent every aspect of the legal code for it. And inevitably, you're going to get into issues of illegitimacy. You know, why do you get an attorney in this stage but not this stage? Why is the evidence revealed here but not here? And that, as a result, the whole system can be questioned quite easily. And that's something that has happened with the military commissions and so on, which, you know, were a poorly thought through attempt, in my opinion, to do this, but nevertheless were an attempt. But there's an immediate charge of that illegitimacy, and you know, what I've realized, which again, I think any lawyer would, anyone with legal training would have recognized instantly, is the accretions that have come to our legal code over the centuries and the value of them. And so the problem with doing anything new is just that. And I, in a very different way, I've wrestled with this issue on a domestic intelligence agency, which I'm for. I mean, to me, we have a domestic intelligence agency called the FBI. It's just not very good at domestic intelligence. It's not what it does. Bureaucratically, I like the idea of having a distinct organization. But you get into all these questions of what should its powers be, where should it be, and so on, and there's a risk of creating a very dysfunctional organization from scratch, which has largely been the fate of the post-9/11 organizations we've created when it comes to terrorism, whether it's Homeland Security or to a lesser but still real degree the NCTC, where these are not particularly well-run organizations. And it's not through lack of trying. It's not a case of incompetent leadership. It's just very, very hard to put all these pieces together in the current system. To go back to your question about trying to manage this whole issue at home, this is something to me that's exceptionally important, that trying to get that public support behind it. And here's where this goes to this issue of public debate, where with all these issues that have come up, I mean, what I've been wrestling with is on September 12, 2001, I was asked, I'm sure I'm on record somewhere, would the United States be hit again on the U.S. homeland? Yes. And by now I'm wrong. You know, if it happens tomorrow, I was still wrong. My time horizon was not, you know, sometime in the next 100 years will the United States be hit again, but in the next couple of years will the United States be hit again. And we've passed that stage. And as a result, I've been thinking very hard about why I'm wrong, and part of it goes to, I think, the nature of the organization and its strengths. But part of it to me is, after 9/11, the organization decentralized operations to a degree, which meant that in countries where it had a supportive community, let's say Britain, let's say Pakistan, it could do attacks. But in the United States, exceptionally difficult because the Muslim community was not at all supportive. In addition, because the organization was on the run, infiltration was much harder. Anything that required a couple of years and a lot of money to do, there's a good chance we're going to catch that number 3. There's a good chance that we're going to kill a key operator. And as a result, it's harder to infiltrate, and they don't have the base to draw on. So the domestic threat to the United States is less. Now, I'm still waiting for an angry American Muslim to pick up a machine gun and shoot a bunch of people in a shopping mall. But that's exceptionally hard to prevent. So in terms of the broader attacks, I think the threat is lower than I certainly thought on September 12th. And I think that needs to be communicated to the American people. It's happening by default to a degree in the campaigns, where people are trying to bring up terrorism. And people say, yeah, can we get into healthcare, please? You know, can you move along? But that's actually not through the volition of politicians. And I would like to see politicians kind of embrace this issue more directly.
Back.
I'm Georgetown, Virginia Tech. I have a question about the we that you're using, and particularly alliances, and in particular with Russia. What should the U.S. policy be towards Russia? And I'm thinking of this in the context of the phrase global war on terror, which you haven't mentioned. But some people include Beslan as part of that. I wonder whether you would accept that particular explanation. And then the second alliance that's really crucial is the one with Israel. That's the first question. The second question is about prioritization and hierarchies. Where does counterterrorism fit in the grand hierarchies of threats facing the United States? The whole kind of universe of global dangers from AIDS to global warming. I think it's a very important question to place the arguments you're making about priorities within a larger context.
I would agree. Global war on terrorism. It's a term that every analyst hates, but that's not the point. The administration has tried to come up with alternative terms, so have Democratic candidates, and they've never stuck. And there's an intuitive sense when you say global war, okay, it's going to happen in lots of places, war, lots of effort, and so on. Yes, I would like to see, the term, five-front war, carefully using other tools. Ain't going to happen. And it's because this is a tool for domestic rallying the people. And I'm okay with that. I mean, again, go back to terrorism at its essence is a psychological tool. And so is counterterrorism. If you can convince people that losing 5 people from a terrorist attack is not the end of the world, that's quite a success. And you need that resilience. So if we can build it up with certain terms, wonderful. I'm not someone who believes that it has to inherently prioritize the military instrument. People say that, but I actually see no reason why when you use the term war on terrorism that has to mean you use the military all the time. The president has said you don't have to. Other people have said you don't have to. To me, we've had wars on cancer. And no one ever says, oh, we have a war on cancer. That must mean that we're going to call out the 82nd Airborne. I mean, that's just something that I think people delight in kind of dissecting these terms. You could have done basically what we've done without Iraq, and I think many people who are critical of the war metaphor would have been more accepting of it. In terms of key allies, alliances should largely be based on a couple issues to me. One is the degree of their jihadist problem as it relates to the United States. The other is, is our embrace of these countries going to cause us more problems or more hurt? So a country like Russia, the Chechens are not particularly anti-American on the grand scheme of things. So do we need to make this an American priority from a counterterrorism point of view? No. I'm actually much more concerned about what's happening in Algeria and the implications of that for Europe. But that's another nasty situation where the Algerian government is incredibly brutal. And if we get into bed with these people, we are associating ourselves with them. And you can, with Israel, to me, it's a broader issue. Israel is certainly not part of the kind of, no one has, to me, credibly said Hamas is part of the jihadist movement. In fact, Hamas is fighting, has a jihadist splinter it's kind of fighting against at the moment. To me, there are reasons to support Israel as an ally. And there are reasons to work with Israel from a counterterrorism point of view, retaliatory interests in the region. But I don't consider Hamas part of the global war on terrorism. Prioritization, this is everything. And I think counterterrorism should be a priority, but not the priority. And I put relations among the great powers, close to the top of the list. The good news is I think that several years of neglect have led our China policy in the right direction. I think it's going okay. I think the emergence of China and India as major powers should be, these are things that 100 years from now, in my security studies program at Georgetown, people are going to be studying. And making sure that goes as well as it can should be a priority of the President of the United States. I'm someone who has a fairly broad set of domestic goals. And some of them cost money. And I'd rather spend money on that than much of the Homeland Defense. So to me, yes, counterterrorism should be on the list. The President should be concerned about it. But it shouldn't be the driver of U.S. policy. It shouldn't be the driver of government reorganization. And the problem with this, though, is, I've been on the 9/11 Commission. I've been on other sorts of endeavors. If we had the Guinea-Bissau Commission, the Guinea-Bissau Commission would conclude that more attention should be paid to Guinea-Bissau. That's the job of these commissions. And they're right. But the problem is the President of the United States' time is finite. And, he or she can only work on so many issues. And so to me, you need to put these issues together and not treat them in isolation in terms of where should priorities be. I have my own personal set of priorities. I suspect everyone in this room has his or hers. This is why we have elections, which is we have politicians who are elected on the promise of going after certain priorities over others. And to me, that's a political decision, and appropriately so.
All right, go ahead.
Hal Richmond, former State Department, and senior analyst of public opinion research. You mentioned earlier Pakistan, and one of the characteristics of Pakistan and Pakistanis is the highly negative image, even in the Muslim world, jihad is the local, and on the other hand, sympathetic to Iran. It would seem, certainly if we were to intervene without a Pakistani government acquiescence, it would be highly unpopular.
Absolutely.
Even with it, it would be unpopular. And it seems to distinguish our intervention in Afghanistan. You say some more about how we should be prepared if their operation continues to blossom, jihadist operation blossoms.
Well, you're absolutely right, and you want to avoid direct operations if you possibly can. And in particular, I think Waziristan today, and you, I suspect, know better than I, is a good example where you just kind of, there are groups of young men in particular who are willing to fight outsiders. And when you come in, you attract those. You generate a certain amount of resistance that wouldn't have happened without your presence. So I think that we have to recognize that by going in larger, we will generate a larger backlash to our presence. But there is a very big question to me, which is, what if there was another large-scale terrorist attack? And I don't mean 10 people, I mean 1,000. To me, it's likely to emanate from the tribal parts of Pakistan. just like 9/11 emanate from Afghanistan. And there will be a tremendous political push in this country to do something. And something that really frustrated me as part of the 9/11 investigations I did was the lack of planning for operations in Afghanistan. Now, that said, I don't think there was political will before 9/11 to go into Afghanistan. But it was amazing how people resisted the planning for the mission. So when you had to do the mission, it was done quite poorly. Or it wasn't done poorly, it was done off the seat of the pants. And our military is quite good at planning. And so to me, this should be something that should be done. You want to not do this. I mean, but you want to not do this in reality. But if you do it, you want it to be planned as well as possible. I would actually, I mean, things I would consider in the short term would be working more with the tribes on the Afghan side to try to push into Pakistan a bit more, to try to disrupt al-Qaeda operations there, to try to put pressure on the cross-border traffic. You have a bit more flexibility in an odd way because of the Musharraf government is focused on other things right now. But Pakistan is, I mean, it's to me a parallel to the Palestinian Authority in some ways, which is what do you do when key partners have no capacity? And Pakistan has a problem of willpower and also a problem of capacity. You know, Pakistan's lost hundreds of troops going after people we wanted them to go after. And so there's a combination. I think their heart was not in it. But that said, it's not a question of, this is not an easy thing to do. So I'm kind of dancing around this question in a complete sense because I'd much rather not intervene. But at times you have to intervene. And what I want is the capability to do so. I mean, what I'd like to do, what I'd like think tanks to do is, think tanks can't come up with campaign plans, but they can come up with broad principles for intervention. I mentioned the Domestic Intelligence Service. One thing I saw after 9/11, which we all saw, was the USA Patriot Act, which has some good things, has some silly things. And part of the reason it has that is it was put together in about 24 hours and rammed through in another 24. That doesn't have to be. You could have things like a domestic intelligence service that people have thought about and are, is on the shelf, and you could take it down if you need it. And that's to me the role of, of people, in this building, which is, yes, I generally think we're largely irrelevant when it comes to the day-to-day of government. But at times there's a very active hunger for new ideas or new approaches, and they will pull things down the shelf from outsiders. And so on a number of things, and Pakistan as a military intervention, domestic intelligence service, on a number of things I would like to see that planning done by serious people.
Right in the back.
Hi, Cassandra Smith from CSIS. You mentioned that al-Qaeda has been able to co-opt more remote insurgencies throughout the world. And I'm wondering what those links consist of. Are they completely ideological, or are there regional affiliates who might be transferring resources, and what can be done to interrupt those links? You did mention that the U.S. military might be deployed in assisting with counterinsurgency operations, but how could we avoid a backlash?
When I said in those cases deploying the U.S. military, what I usually meant was a very kind of low-profile training mission. So traditional special operations forces, not direct U.S. intervention, to be clear. Let's start with a few things. Let's start with some good news. Often these organizations link up with al-Qaeda because they're failing domestically. And in the past it was because they want resources. Increasingly it's because they want more credibility at home, that having the al-Qaeda brand gives them a certain star power. But that usually means that their local goal of defeating government X, whether it's Egypt or Algeria or Jordan or whatever it is floundering. And so that's, it's important to keep that in mind because that's the initial strategic picture before we get into the tactical question of how do you reduce this. The best way to reduce it is always to build up the host government in question. So you want their capacity. A pet peeve issue of mine is the issue of police training. When you've gotten to the issue of a full-blown insurgency, it's already pretty nasty. But in a lot of cases, you're dealing with local groups that are relatively small, where the primary counterterrorism and counterinsurgency instrument is the police. And the U.S. government has almost no capacity to handle this problem. We have a number of programs scattered throughout the U.S. government. They're all underfunded. This is something that institutionally, every institution doing it hates. So the very best people are not focused on this. You have a relative lack of kind of high-level attention driving this. When the military does it, they tend to be training cheap light infantry rather than actual police. So the basic intelligence function and daily security function is neglected. I'm not sure how I got on the police tension, but it was the broader point of the need to train capacity, not just military capacity, but in particular, I would say police and intelligence. I tend to be somewhat skeptical of the broader issue of political and economic reform, which is what some people push on this issue. I'm for it, but I'm for it as an American, not as a counterterrorism specialist. And I tend to think that we don't really know how to do this particularly well, especially on the political side. And as a result, there's a lot of kind of small unpleasant things that can happen in terms of government capacity in the short term. Capacity tends to weaken. But in the long term, we have no guarantees we're actually going to succeed. And in particular, many of the governments that would come to power would likely be relatively anti-American. I mean, if there were free elections in Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, and we may see in Pakistan, we're going to get a government that's more anti-American and harder to work with. At times, I'm okay with that. But from a counterterrorism point of view, there is a real cost to that, and we need to recognize it. This goes to the issue of other priorities. I don't think counterterrorism should be the only priority. But that said, we have to recognize we're paying a price. Disrupting these links is extremely difficult. At times, it's simply propaganda. Yes, we're al-Qaeda in villain country here. Very hard to stop that. At times, it is a resource flow one way or another. Iraq has been funding al-Qaeda Central, but usually, historically, it was the other way around. Often, it's skilled operators being trained, whether it's in Pakistan or elsewhere. And in particular, it tends to be a kind of networking and branding device where people cooperate more on a day-to-day level, whether it's local operations or more global ones. You want to turn these organizations against al-Qaeda Central. The caveat for the United States is that we should think, it seems intuitive to say, of course, we'd rather these people hate local regimes than they hate Americans. But often the local regimes are more vulnerable. And there's a real question. I mean, in a few countries, I'll take Saudi Arabia in particular. There are lots of, Saudis are the #1 source of recruits for jihadists in Iraq. So wouldn't it be great if they weren't going to Iraq to kill Americans? Absolutely. But if they stay home and kill Saudis and risk destabilizing that government, that could be disastrous for U.S. interests as well. And we have to recognize that it isn't simply that one policy is going to kind of bless us in all sorts of ways, that success in one area often leads to problems in another area.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Yeah, Donna Dalen, and I'd like to go back to the use of military force in tomahawk therapy. There's an argument out there that after the USS Cole was bombed in October of 2000, that the Clinton administration should have responded more forcefully with some kind of military intervention as a deterrent. And what would be your response to that?
I've thought about that issue a lot because both the Bush administration points the finger at the Clinton administration. The Clinton folks say, oh, we teed it up for the Bushies, they backed up. I think that, I don't know what we would have hit. Al-Qaeda was waiting for the TLAM strike. So it wasn't like, they weren't ready for that. They felt that the 1998 strikes were a huge boon to their organization. And they were waiting for a response. So to me, we could have felt good about ourselves by responding with TLAMs, but I don't know what it would have done. Now, having said that, I think we could have stepped up our covert action, our aid to the Northern Alliance, our intelligence efforts, but none of those publicly would have done as much.
Can I make one suggestion? Sure. We had put the Taliban on notice starting in '98 that we'd hold them responsible for al-Qaeda's actions, and we did know where Mullah Omar lived, even if we didn't know where Osama bin Laden lived. And since we'd already put them on notice that they were responsible for these actions, we could have taken out the Taliban military headquarters. I'm not advocating this, I'm just saying the Clinton administration did nothing, and then the Bush administration did nothing. And clearly, when 9/11 came along, al-Qaeda either calculated that nothing would happen again, because they didn't know how successful it was going to be by their own accounts, or that there would be a Soviet-style ground invasion, and they sort of win either way. But the fact that we did nothing clearly wasn't helpful. And I think there was potential options.
The point about Mullah Omar is a fair point. The number of, frankly, assassination attempts that have worked from standoff, there are some, but it's exceptionally limited. And what it usually requires is superb real-time intelligence. And I mean, the exceptions would be these Israeli cases where they've gone after Hamas members. And there, it's a line that the former head of Shin Bet, now the Minister of Police,
and Borders uses, which is no Palestinian child draws a picture of the sky without a helicopter in it. Which basically his point was, we have 24-hour surveillance over everything. We didn't have that over Afghanistan, and we might have been able to kill someone. But in general, I think that they would have rejoiced in the blood of the martyr because it wouldn't have had a huge operational impact. We know 9/11 was on the books and moving forward well before this. So I'm skeptical that a limited military intervention after the Cold would have been a good thing. That said, I do think that I have the benefit of hindsight, but that dramatically ratcheting up the pressure could have been done much earlier on the Taliban in particular. And we hesitated for reasons that in hindsight look very odd, even though at the time I'm more sympathetic.
Sorry, do I have to ask a question?
Alex Solota, Simpson Center. Are there challenges for Pakistani government, British government, maybe other European governments in tracking individuals who are part of the Pakistani diaspora who travel back to Pakistan for training?
Oh, tremendous challenges. It's overwhelming. Yes, the Pakistani government has, I think, a pretty good intelligence service. There is, first of all, the question of sympathy. Parts of the intelligence service, especially at the lower levels, have some degree of sympathy. But many of the operatives are pretty good. And they have multiple passports, multiple phones. Add to that, there are a lot of them. And then go further than that, which is people show up on the radar screen often after they become involved in the group rather than before. So that initial radicalization, some guy's going home. Very hard to say, let's flag that guy. And monitoring people on a constant basis is incredibly manpower intensive. So even the Pakistanis, which have lots of people on the ground, yes, there are certainly limits. And when you get anything transnational, it's very hard. If you're talking higher level figures, sure. I think that any particular individual can be watched. But when you're talking about hundreds of people coming back, much more difficult.
It's worth pointing out that 400,000 British citizens of Pakistani descent visit Pakistan every year, so 4 is a lot of people.
Just one question to you again. I'm sorry to ask a question. Before that, I'm a law professor, and on your issue of the National Security Court, I don't think about this much, but we did create the International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia. I was involved with that slightly. Created rules and procedures. It can be done if one wishes. My question goes back to Mr. Mitchell, sort of a meta question. What he was saying was that you're like Dennis Kucinich, I'm a Republican, but I turned to him and he's a charming little guy. I think it was more than Dennis Kucinich. But I think the world has said that we, who are the country of hope, have moved to the country of fear. We hunker down. So my question is, as you focus on all these fantastic things you know about IOM, can we also move to a country of hope? Even as we focus, I would call everything you said details in the fight for the future. You think we can do it? Both batten down the way you suggested and get much better, and not perfect, and still be seen once again as a country of kind of almost irresponsible, reckless hope?
To a degree, yes. To a degree, no. Certainly I think we can do better. And we have a couple of huge advantages. One is, I tend to think that the United States offers a vision of freedom, money, and sex. And most people in the world want at least one, not all three of those things. So we are attractive beyond our policies. What we stand for has tremendous appeal. And so I do believe that. And I would add to that, our educational institutions are incredibly popular. And often so are the American people. And I don't mean that in kind of everyone loves us sort of way, but we tend to be, in a naive way, kind of sweet. We go overseas and are more open to other cultures, and I hear this again and again. Now, we're not perfect, but the competition for kind of worst country overseas, is pretty intense when it comes to citizens' behavior. That said, I think that there are going to be limits. Many of our policies are unpopular and are unlikely to change. And yes, I think Iraq has driven some of that. But even take Iraq out of the equation, that's going to happen. There were things the Clinton administration was doing that were intensely unpopular. The U.S. use of military force is, to a degree, unpopular. I do think there is kind of a New York Yankees phenomenon, or I should say Boston Red Sox these days, which is people don't like the kind of champion, in the sense that it's always kind of nice to see the champion taken down a notch. I don't want to exaggerate that. I don't think people want Americans killed for that reason. But I think that's a phenomena is quite real. So yeah, I think there are limits. An important source of support beyond all these things I would add is immigration initiatives. This is something that hasn't gotten much attention, but a very good friend of mine grew up in India, and he said, he goes, when I grew up in India, every educated Indian knew the United States was a fundamentally racist society. He goes, that's just, we all agreed on that. But he goes, when the 10,000th Indian software millionaire came home, that just began to seem a little silly, And I think that perspective is actually, that's almost a default perspective when people come here and they say, I can do my business on anything. I can do whatever I want. I can work hard to do this. That does generate a lot of goodwill. So I don't think we're going to go back to kind of 1949, where the United States is this beacon of hope and freedom to much of the world. But that said, I think we can do better than where we are today.
Final question.
No, actually, the answer was
Embedded in.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, then I just want to take one more swing at this, and that is, I'm interested in knowing what you think, or both of you think, about how important it is for citizens of the United States to have a sort of terror alert mentality, the sort of the signs on the road.
I misunderstood your original question. I was focused on kind of bigger picture in some ways rather than a specific question. Not terribly important. I think that if you have a large domestic terrorism problem, that domestic awareness matters a lot. But if the problem is mainly infiltrators and so on, not terribly important. The caveat to that is you want certain communities to have an awareness of it. And in particular the U.S. Muslim community, which you're trying to win over their goodwill. And that's a community from which, especially people dealing with immigrants, are likely to associate with to some degree, just for kind of day-to-day operations. If you look at the 9/11 plot, a couple of the key figures were kind of given special permission to associate with local Muslims because they weren't able to function in the United States without help. And so those are people you actually do want to have that. But that, usually the kind of generic, broad, everyone should be watching works directly against that. Because people, a classic thing is, that guy next to me is reading the Quran, I'm going to call security. And we laugh about that in Washington, which is a fairly cosmopolitan international city, but I grew up in a small town, and these perceptions are out there. And so I think that the broader ones can even work against what we want, while the narrower ones still do matter.
Thank you very much, Dan.
Sure.